Welcome to another episode of Lifting the Lid on Technology, your go-to insights for the latest tech and innovation. I'm Barry White, your host and VCIO at SoftSource FeedBridge. Well, welcome back to Lifting the Lid. My guest today, Steve Isles from HP Aruba. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for coming back again.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Steve, for those who perhaps didn't join our last podcast that you were on, maybe it might be worth you just giving a brief little introduction to yourself and what your role is at Aruba. And then I thought maybe we'd have a bit of a chat about, I guess, being the beginning of the year. Let's reflect a little bit on 2024, maybe a little bit of a scorecard on New Zealand in terms of what we're seeing out there.
Sure. Once again, Steve Isles is my name. I lead HP Aruba Networking's SASE practice, so Secure Access Service Edge practice across what we call Southpac, which is effectively ANZ plus some Pacific Islands, so big scope. I've got a small sales team, and I've got a couple of techos, very capable, deeply skilled techos that support us in our efforts. And I've been in the industry for about 20 years, worked for some big vendors around the place in the data center, across services, hyperconvergence marketplace not long ago. And now in the SASE side of things, it's fascinating, and it's opened up a whole new world that I didn't even really understand or knew existed kind of until now.
Well, hopefully, Steve, we'll get time to sort of talk a bit about SASE and perhaps some who are listening to this may not be totally familiar with exactly what that means. But before we get to that, it's been another year. How's it been from a security standpoint?
You know what? It's an expensive question. And we could probably spend half an hour talking about that alone, right?
Sure.
What have I learned over the last 12 months that will take into the coming year? A lot of organizations are worried and concerned. It feels like data breaches and security concerns are very topical, that they're getting a lot of clicks, that you see them on a lot of rags. And the nature of things now is when, as you know, as our listeners will know, when you click on a thing, you start seeing more of that thing on your phone and other places. So there is generally out there's a feeling of nervousness about security and breaches and other things. And particularly with our customers and also, our HP long-term customers as well as new ones, there's a lot of market testing and a market sounding going on because people are looking for a bit of guidance, a bit of leadership. And that feels like the overwhelming sentiment. So it's not necessarily a negative feeling in the market, but there is a lot of activity and it's taken very, very seriously. That's the last 12 months was about messaging and understanding. And I think we'll continue a lot of that moving into the next 12 months because we're relatively new into this space. But I think we're going to see a lot more activity, particularly in New Zealand, because that sentiment, New Zealand is overwhelmingly punching above its weight in terms of, everything we're discussing at the moment.
That's interesting because I was reading a paper recently from PwC, and I think you're right. The level of awareness out there is definitely getting better. This particular survey showed about 45% of New Zealand businesses were either had experienced or were aware of another business who had experienced some form of attack or some sort of breach. So I think that highlights that there is a lot more awareness out there. Do you think that this fear, if you like, of cybercrime is also a blocker to some businesses? Let's take AI, for example, which everybody's talking about. And, are some businesses a little bit hesitant to jump into AI because they fear the ramifications of exposing their data, that sort of thing?
They absolutely. Yeah, absolutely do. Ironically, the larger the organization, or even in some instances, some government departments are embracing things like AI technologies to me more readily than smaller organizations. Whereas historically with newer or emerging techs, the reverse would typically be true. Large organizations, government, federal agencies are typically fairly averse to new tech. They don't want to be on the bleeding edge. Smaller organizations can be a little averse to this because in a lot of cases, they don't quite know where to start. They don't know how to embrace it. They don't know how to look at it. It's a little bit scary and daunting. And when they get the right guidance and advice, I find organizations are embracing things more readily. Once again, I don't think we're at the fear state yet, depending on who you talk to, of course. But there is certainly some reticence there, and it just fundamentally comes down to understanding. And let's face it, when we talk about whether or not technology or processes or new things are embraced, typically fear is rooted in education and awareness. we do what we do.
Mm.
Hopefully we can dispel some fears and help people embrace new things. But that's kind of what I'm seeing. And the perspective on AI is one that can be both positive and negative, right? So, particularly in a lot of the technology that we're developing as HPE, we're a big AI player, right? We've got partnerships with NVIDIA. We're doing stuff, AI stuff on site and from clouds and other things. And that's good because, collectively, we're the good guys, so to speak. People are starting to think, well, can't the bad guys use AI too? Well, the answer is potentially, right? So how do we combat that? So there's prevailing uncertainty, awareness, education fuels that reticence. Yeah, that's kind of the feeling out there,
We'll come back to that AI discussion a little bit more because I think, I'm really interested in, this idea that, AI is going to save us from perhaps all the things that can go wrong, but it's also a threat at the same time, right? But
well, maybe The Matrix was a documentary. We don't know.
Very true. So we've talked about kind of the negative things that are going on, but what are some of the positive things? I mean, what have we seen? Again, that focus on New Zealand. What have we seen as some of the positive trends that we're seeing? I mean, one of the things I've noticed from Soft Source vBridge's perspective is, a lot more businesses have embraced MFA for argument's sake, and that's really great, right? And again, if you look at the numbers, there's been a significant increase in businesses adopting MFA. Has that been your experience as well?
It is. It used to be the domain of large organizations with huge teams. Now it's not. People are able to do it. And I agree with you. I like seeing that. The positives that are around, that organizations are starting to really consider, they're not so insular anymore, but introspection and awareness, and then looking for guidance and new ideas. That's what I'm seeing. And across, my little pocket of the world, which is just the ANZ, and as we talked about before, New Zealand's quite progressive and open to talk about new things, new ways of doing things. Yeah, once again, what used to be the domain of large organizations in terms of multi-factor authentication, because people can now do it with their phone, accessing, their cloud services and stuff that they use personally, translating that to business is a lot simpler. Also, if I go back to commentary that we had before during the previous podcast, I think we said something along the lines of technology like this is now accessible, whereas 10 years ago it'd take $10 million in 6 months to make work. It's just not like that anymore. Software and tech is so much smarter, and the ability to adopt it is so much simpler. So MFA, absolutely. I also find that the IT crowd, and I use that specifically, hopefully I don't get in trouble with some legal people, but the IT crowd that you're imagining are now at the table, and they're now respected, and they're having input into fundamental business decisions because people understand the importance of what the IT crowd, particularly the security team, are doing, right? So that's a real positive to me as well.
And that's a great TV series as well for those who haven't seen it, the IT crowd.
So, I can't get in trouble now.
Yeah.
Barry, maybe getting in trouble. I'm not sure.
It's a bit of a Bible, that one, on our industry. There was a comment you made there, Steve, talking about New Zealand boxing above its weight. And I'm kind of interested to dig into that because I've been following some of the initiatives in the New Zealand government around what's referred to as the digital divide. And, a lot of that focus is around social economics and, trying to bring not just young people in New Zealand, but a whole range of different groups, rural will be another one, bringing them into a more modern era. And one of the numbers that seems to be emerging from some of the work that's happening there is that whilst we as a country we're early adopters in certain parts of our economy of technology, we're also lagging behind some other countries as well, such as the United States and China in particular, who are, for their size, are very advanced in their adoption of technology across the board. And the big thing that's driving that is trust. And so, in other words, here in New Zealand, we've got a lot of older equipment. We've got, retailers, manufacturers, various different people who have often got computers that are running old operating systems, old hardware. And by definition, that makes them potentially more vulnerable, right?
Of course, absolutely. And that's not just an NZ thing. That's an Oz thing.
I was going to say, yeah,
yeah, and it's kind of been a perennial thing during my career, right? Keeping the tech, keeping the plumbing current and patched and updated Hey, it's the ongoing effort from beleaguered IT teams around the place. Do I see that as a major issue? Yeah, and organizations recognize it too. And it means that vendors around the place are getting smart as well. Like, these days, it is quite common to see, endpoint as a service and subscription models for people to have things that are managed that don't worry about that they're all up to date and other things. So the market seems to be progressing. Holdover, long-term technology, and difficulty patching, maintaining, and obsolescence, I think is an ongoing issue, particularly in larger organizations, I find. Smaller businesses are a little more nimble and appears to be maybe a secondary consideration. Maybe, this is broad sweeping statements, I guess, but it does usher in, challenges like that does push organizations to progress and develop technology that can bridge those gaps, I suppose. So, that's where delivering security out of the cloud that follows users independent of device, etc., can assist, but it doesn't solve everything, right? In my experience, systems, people, process, right? Systems, people, process. Systems are usually the easiest bits, the tech. And then you got to get the people to do the right stuff and you got to have processes to support them.
Yeah.
And I think, if we could solve every technology challenge under the sun, you and I right now, we're going to solve the people and the process thing. Maybe not overnight, right?
Yeah.
Going back to a comment before, you could have really slick systems that are really modern, but if you don't have the awareness and the capability and the education to use them properly, that's where you can come unstuck.
You touched on a point there that I wanted to talk to you about today, and that was that idea of large businesses or larger organisations versus what we commonly refer to as SMEs in New Zealand, which of course makes up the majority of businesses in New Zealand. One of the other numbers that came out that I thought was quite interesting, I picked this up from CERT-NZ. Again, this is looking back on 2024, was that there had been quite a significant shift towards SMBs in particular with cyber attacks, and that number was up around 60%, which was around 15% up on last year. So I thought that was quite an interesting observation. So it was showing that, perhaps, I'm just interested in your perspectives on this, is there a perception that, the bad guys only go after the big organizations, and if you're a smaller business, you don't have to worry about it so much?
Unfortunately, not anymore. It's interesting, right? 15 years ago, 10, 15 years, I remember hearing about the first big breaches I'd heard associated with the PlayStation network a decade or more ago. Like there were very big businesses that were getting impacted by some very, very clever, hacker type individuals. And historically, you used to think these people would sit in their mum's basement and they're hacking away on a computer somewhere in the world. Not so much anymore. It's given the prevalence of the tool sets available these days, how slick software is, the ability to scan a network for vulnerabilities and get in. It's a lot simpler now. And so we're finding that hacker groups, they don't have to focus on the big guys anymore.
No.
They can spread the load, spread the risk, and if they can get in, they can get in. And the other side to this is the emergence of cyber criminality for hire. So there are organizations and syndicates that offer their services to different actors around the place. It's kind of like outsourcing hacking, right? So if you don't want to build a whole bunch of people and get a whole bunch of skill sets in house, well, then you pay a group to go do it for you. I mean, there are industries building that are doing this stuff. They're dropping further and further down the pecking order in terms of scale because they're getting the payback. And in a lot of cases, when you've got the tech that's smart, that can brute force, that can analyze, going back to things like AI engines and other things, that can analyze huge data sets quickly, that can conduct tests very efficiently on a broad scale. We're seeing evidence of that around the place. So no, it's not just the exclusive domain of the large businesses anymore. We're seeing it across the board.
Yeah, and that's certainly, I guess that number reflects that. But I think the scary part is with that 15% increase.
That's huge.
If this was anything else like the road toll or cancer rates in New Zealand or something like that, there'd be, people would be out in the street protesting, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Cybercrime seems to kind of slip under the radar a little bit, but, I think you're right. I think things are changing. With the shift to the cloud now, and again, amongst sort of, SMBs now embracing things like Microsoft 365, those sorts of technologies. And you mentioned the idea of paying somebody else to do the job, right? There's this concept of misconfiguration. We're starting to see those people who kind of do it themselves, who may sign up to these subscription services, but perhaps don't know the nuances involved in configuring these things, whether it be a network device or whether it be, access points or whatever the case may be. What's your thoughts around that? Because, there seems to be some of the things that's driving these numbers is, cloud's great and it's got some great security features, but only if you know how to set them up properly, right?
I'm not sure we're ever going to solve that problem in your and my lifetime. Tell me, Barry, is that a new thing? The ability to adopt and configure, right?
Well, designers like to do it themselves, right? It's a common talk.
They do. And in a lot of cases, given where we are, it's absolutely forgivable, right? The idea that you could get a technology that is largely off the shelf, that's very widely adopted, effectively read the manual, RTM, and then deploy, it's very, very attractive. And in a lot of cases, organizations get it off the ground and run with it. And it can be years until they find out how many gaps they have. Like we have engagements right now with, like, right at this minute, I've got little Teams groups going, right, where we are working with organizations both in NZ and in Australia here, and we're identifying configuration and architectural decisions that were made 10 years ago that no one knew were still there, and sending data to places that it should never, ever be sent, And this comes back to that homegrown idea, like really, really smart people, usually stress-related, right? We're going to get a thing in. We're going to do it fast. There's an issue right now, and I'm really clever. I'll get it done. And then that incredibly clever, busy person gets it mostly done and then focuses on other things. Flash forward 10 years, where are we, right? So I see that with some very large businesses and some very small ones. Yeah. And it's very consistent. And I mean, back in Brisbane today, I was with some of my colleagues in Sydney yesterday, and we talked to a customer and had to spend a bunch of time with the customer. They thought they needed to buy a thing to satisfy some requirements. And we left that meeting and said, our conclusion was they don't need to buy a thing. They simply need to invest in education, and we need to facilitate that. And then once they're educated on the technology they've bought, we're going to find that perceived need evaporates, right? But we caught that in time, right? And so, yes, what are my thoughts on that? It exists. It exists everywhere. And I think it's incumbent upon, soft source vBridge and HP and HPE Aruba networking to make sure that what people are buying, they know how to use, that we're taking responsibility for that awareness piece, because it can avoid so much cost and risk.
Yeah. That's been one of the really encouraging things that's, again, come out of the last year. We've seen a significant increase on the number of organizations who are investing in cybersecurity training, right? And that number's really, really jumped up over the previous year. And I think that's really encouraging because it's really showing an emphasis by businesses, small and large, around investing in their employees and building up their knowledge around cybersecurity, because it is a collective problem. It's not just about technology, guarding the back door. It's also about people.
Exactly.
Their habits, because it's human habits that these bad guys go after, right? And clicking on the wrong links, those sorts of things. So, I think security awareness training has started to play a really important role. It needs, I think what I'm trying to say is businesses are starting to see the value in that and the importance of investing in their staff and their knowledge, particularly as we enter into this period of AI, right, which is putting more responsibility on employees to act responsibility, particularly when it comes to data. You don't want them going on to ChatGPT, for argument's sake, and pasting somebody's CV into ChatGPT, which people are doing, by the way, which is kind of scary.
Yeah, like it's not happening, right?
Without even thinking about the PII data that exists within that document I've just pasted into what is effectively a public service. So, yeah, I think that's one of the really encouraging outcomes of last year. So the last thing, Steve, I wanted to chat to you about today, I was interested in really on the back of the recent launch of the Microsoft data center here in New Zealand, and we've really seen a shift, particularly across Māori and across a lot of other organisations that are working in that space, talking about data sovereignty now and looking at through the the lens of data residency versus data sovereignty, it's starting to recognise data as a valuable commodity, not just about how people protect their own business. I'm interested in some of your thoughts around that and some of the conversations that Aruba are having with customers, around data sovereignty.
Good question. And we're having a lot of them. So New Zealand's been in an interesting situation, right, where no public cloud providers until Microsoft just opened up. And by the way, no one was celebrating more than me, because that enables me to do some stuff locally, which I'll get to in a second.
Mm.
But the data management rules, public records management have been in place for long enough in New Zealand. So there's a framework there around how it's governed. But because, particularly using cloud services, notwithstanding any special dispensations that some organizations may have, for sending data across to Sydney and back, but to use cloud services meant that a lot of data for public and private sector data would have to cross the ditch, come to Sydney and then back again and hairpin back again, right? And it meant that things were generally felt a little confused. When you have a discussion in Australia about the Public Records Act or data management, where it got information lifecycle management, you could always fairly confidently talk about data that's domiciled in country. In New Zealand, you'd talk about that and you'd make special exceptions for, it's got to shoot over and then back. And then I would ask questions, wanting to learn, because I'm not the expert, right, on local conditions. I would ask about the implications there and be told, there's special dispensation we get if we use provider X, but not provider Y. And it feels like there's a little confusion and a little bit of concern and worry about how to handle things properly, right? Microsoft's opening up in town is such a good idea and such a great thing for New Zealand business generally, public and private. I hear the other major provider, I don't know who we're allowed to mention on these calls, so I've got to be careful, but the other major provider who used to be an online bookshop, they're looking at opening up very, very soon. And so we're going to see the big players on the global stage appearing in NZ, and it means we can have a far more clear and concise and coherent discussion about data protection. And the funny thing is, when I talked to larger organizations last year, for the fact that this is the year that red compliance is going to be shaken up. The feeling is that 2025 is the year for red compliance shake-up, that things are going to get tighter and people are starting to plan for it. And so they're the discussions we're having.
Yeah. And I think the interesting one that, perhaps not all our listeners are aware of is the upcoming Data Sovereignty Act in New Zealand, which is currently being worked through. We haven't really seen the details of that yet, but what's really going to emerge from that initiative is that distinction that I touched on before between data sovereignty versus data residency. That is the physical location of the data compared to the sovereignty of the data, or who has the legal jurisdiction or authority over that data, right? And really being able to understand and distinguish between those two things. And I think as these public providers come into the market, those are the sorts of questions that organisations, small and large, are going to have to ask, depending on their line of business, right? So if you're an organisation that, for example, is working in the cultural space in some form, or is interacting with other countries on those levels, then you need to be aware of the impacts of how these new regulations will impact the way you operate. And so there's quite a lot of growing talk around that space, and I think it's something we'll have to revisit over the course of the year as it starts to take shape, because I think it's going to be a really, really interesting space.
Agreed. Actually, and if I cast my mind back as well, because now you start to show your age, right? I remember when the sovereignty discussions and things we're having over here, right? Where is the data? Where does it live? Who's allowed to see it? Or those 10 individuals or those 10 countries can, and these 5 can't. How can you make certain guarantees? And it turned a lot of people on a lot of knots for a long time, right? So, I mean, it's good that these things get hammered out, but hopefully New Zealand can learn from others' mistakes. Others took the arrows in the chest, and then it'll be just flick and go through like that. That's how it'll end up.
Steve, that's probably a good point for us to finish on. And as always, it's been been great having you here today. And, look, I'd love to have you back on the podcast. And if you do come back, you'll be the first person to come back 3 times. So maybe that'll be a target to go for.
Actually, before we go, can I make an announcement before anybody else knows about it on this podcast?
Absolutely, of course you can.
So since Microsoft opened up in New Zealand, I know we weren't going to talk about tech specifically, but a little part of what I do is a cloud security bit, the secure service edge bit. And it's all predicated performance, sovereignty, locality, etc., predicated upon points of presence around the world. And now that Microsoft opened up, I have on our schedule a point of presence that I'm being told internally will get set up by the end of February, but I work for a big company with a lot of bureaucracy. So let's say by the end of March, I should have a cloud security point of presence in New Zealand set up, ready to go.
Wow.
You heard it here first.
What a great note to end on, Steve. That's and I hope you don't get a rap on the knuckles for that. But
I'm probably going to get into a lot of trouble now, so I may be asking you for a job back.
Yeah. Well, you're always welcome here, mate. Hey, great to see you as always. And I guess until next time, take care. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks very much. Look forward to it. Thank you.
I'm Barry White signing off. Until next time, keep exploring, keep innovating, and keep lifting that lid.